Information functions. There are a great deal of information functions, a lot of information you can abstract from your cells regarding their formatting, their content, their position, beginning with the ERROR.TYPE function, which will generate a value for the error if there is one, the type function, which will generate a value given what type of data is in your cell, like text or values or array formulas, the info function, which will give you information about the operating environment, and the cell function, which will generate all sorts of values driven by the contents of the cell, the formatting of the cell, and where the cell is. So the ERROR.TYPE function, there's a table set up that shows what value the ERROR.TYPE function will display given the error that's in the reference cell. So I have a number of cells set up here that have formulas that are generating errors. I can use the ERROR.TYPE function, referencing the cell with the error, Control Enter. The null is a 1. The rest of the errors generate the corresponding value that's in the table to the left. The getting data error has to do with when you have queries that are pulling in data into the spreadsheet, and there are cells dependent upon those query results. While that's happening, those cells will display getting data. We don't need to go there to show the functionality of this ERROR.TYPE function. So you might be thinking, well, what good is this? You have an error in a cell and you can convert that error into a number. Well, what this enables you to do is combine this with an if statement, equal if tab, ERROR.TYPE tab, the reference, close the parentheses, equal 1, comma, I'm going to put impossible, the value if it's false, we'll just put a blank cell, Control Enter. So instead of giving the user sort of a cryptic error message like null, which you'll get when you have a formula that generates an impossible result, null, it's a cell that doesn't exist, because my formula is asking the cell to give me the cell's value that's in both of these arrays that I've defined, and there isn't one. There isn't a cell that's both in columns H and J. So the ERROR.TYPE function allows you to convert errors into something that may be more meaningful that you want the user to know instead of div 0 or value or ref or any of the other standard error messages that you get. The type function allows you to, in a general sense, produce a value or a code based on the content of the cell. If the content is a number, and I have a number in cell G12, the type function will return a 1. If it's text, the type function will return a 2, a logical value, true or false. That'll be a value of 4. An error value, or an error message, will be 16, and an array constant will return a value of 64. This can be useful if you're trying to, again, use other logical functions to determine what you want to do with the content that's in a cell, because it may be different if it's a number as opposed to a text or a logical value. So this provides the foundation to build dynamic formulas that are actually reacting to the content or the type of content that's in the cell and producing different results when there's different content. The info function has to do with the operating environment. And I'm going to just build a couple of info functions, equal info tab to select the first one, the directory. So that's the directory path for the file I have currently opened, equal info tab file. That's the total number of active worksheets in all of the open workbooks. I'm not sure what you'd do with that, but you can get that value. Equal info tab origin. This function produces a dynamic result. You have to recalculate the spreadsheet to get it to update, but it's based on the upper leftmost cell that's displayed on the worksheet. Currently that's A1, but if I scroll down a little bit, and I'm going to just click here, and then select the cell, press F2 and enter, that cell will recalculate, And now the origin, as far as what's displayed and what we're looking at, is cell A3. Again, I'm not exactly sure what you would do with that, but you'll never use it if you don't know it exists. Moving on, the operating system. Mine is Windows 32-bit, equal info, tab, recalc. My workbook is currently on automatic recalc. This can be useful because it's helpful to know whether your spreadsheet or your workbook is going to calculate automatically or not. And when you have it on manual calc, there isn't anything to indicate to the user that it's on manual calc unless you use this info function. You can see what version of Excel that you have. Release version, this is 14.0, and then the name of the operating environment. And so I have a Windows environment, which is PC-DOS. If this was a Mac, it would yield a result that says Mac. I'm guessing PC-DOS has to do with the disk operating system language we used to have to utilize before Windows made computer use so much easier. And lastly, there's the cell function. The cell function will generate all sorts of information about your cell, beginning with the cell address, equals CELL, tab, tab again to pull in the address option, selecting a cell, let's pick that one, entering, I get the address of the reference cell. It's an absolute reference. I can also determine a column number, comma, for a reference cell. That's column 5 on the worksheet. That can be useful for building dynamic VLOOKUPs, but there's also a column function that's useful for that as well. We'll get to that when we talk about VLOOKUPs. You can also have the cell function, comma, generate a value of 1 if the cell is formatted to show colors for negative values, which cell B10 is, enter, so we'll get a 1 there. Or you can get tab, tab again, comma, the value of the upper left cell in a range, enter, so we'll get minus 100. And like the info function, you can get the file name, but with this, you can get the file name for a cell that's referenced in another workbook. I'm not going to reference another workbook. I'm just going to reference this one. And there are all sorts of values that you can generate depending upon the formatting of the cell. Equal cell tab, arrowing down, tab again, comma. I'm going to select a reference B10, enter, and the formatting code for cell B10 is C2 minus. We find that right here. So this can be useful to determine what formatting is applied in a cell without having to go to the Format Cells dialog box or without having to put several different values to test to see what formatting is applied. The next option is similar. This will tell you whether you have parentheses that's applied to positive values that are in a cell. Now, why would you do that? I'm not real sure, but you can. That's a positive 100. The negative 100s, in this case, are going to be red. So I had to use a custom format to set this up because there isn't a standard format that provides for parentheses around positive numbers. But if you're using parentheses around positive numbers, this provides a way to determine that this is a positive number because it looks just like a negative number, other than the fact that it's not red. That would be a totally confusing format style to use, but if you use it, you can have the cell function tell you that you're using it. The next cell type, tab, is prefix, comma, the alignment. There are values that will be generated, in this case it's a single quote, depending upon what the alignment of the cell is. I don't have a table displaying those values, but changing the alignment and going back to our cell, F2 enter, I get a double quote. I'm going to move that alignment back to the way it was, F2 enter, and we get the single quote back. The next option, cell tab, has to do with whether a cell is locked or not. Enter. Since all the cells are locked by default, that cell is locked, so it's displaying a 1. Otherwise, it would display a 0. If you watch the movies on protecting the cells and the worksheet and the workbook, you know that having a cell locked is not enough to protect that cell, that you actually also have to protect the worksheet. And similar to column, there's row, tab, comma, and we'll just select B17 as a reference and we'll get 17. The next option will return a B for a blank cell and L for a label if there's a text value in the cell, and a V for a value if the cell doesn't contain a label and it's not blank. Equal cell, tab, arrowing down, type, comma, I'll just select B18. It's blank, so we get a B. And lastly, we can have the cell function display for us the column width. Selecting that as a reference, it's 137 characters wide. And like the prefix option, this is not dynamic. I can change the width of the column, and that result is not going to change unless I recalculate the cell, which I can do by pressing F2, enter. So those are 4 information functions. We started with the error type function that allows us to generate a value driven by what sort of error that we're getting in our cell, that when combined with the if function allows us to produce our own error message. We looked at the type function, which generates sort of a code depending upon whether the content in the cell is a value, a text, a logical, or an error. We looked at the info function that gives us information about the operating environment, including things like the file path and the version of Excel that we're using. And lastly, we looked at the cell function that provides all sorts of information about the formatting, the contents, and the positioning of the cell.